Hello and welcome to InDaily's Election Eve coverage. I'm Tineka Everaardt. It's been a huge week in politics. Both leaders have come out all guns blazing. Tony Abbott appeared on ABC's Q&A, the opposition leader being declared a star of the social media platform, generating almost 25,000 tweets. That's 10,000 more than Gillard inspired last week. According to ABC figures, Q&A might well be the most tweeted event in Australian TV. Meanwhile, members of the public got their chance to ask the big questions. In their second town hall forum, both leaders were publicly grilled, with Julia Gillard being quizzed on the party's treatment of Kevin Rudd.
Members, now you laud Kevin Rudd as a great achiever and expect the people of Australia to vote your party back in for another 3 years. Do you feel like a hypocrite?
I take my fair share, warts and all. You'll judge it on that basis, but I'm also asking you to judge it on looking forward.
Despite this, Julia Gillard came out on top, being ruled the winner 83 votes to 75. In an election where promises have largely been the focus, it was costings that entered the debate late in the election. Federal Shadow Treasurer Joe Hockey released the coalition's costings just 2 days before the election. Mr Hockey made claims that a coalition government would return the economy to a surplus of $6.2 billion by 2013. But when speaking to the ABC, Treasurer Wayne Swan criticised the announcement.
So routine, the dog ate my homework excuse about why they cannot submit through the Charter of Budget Honesty.
The promises were still being made in the 11th hour, with Prime Minister Julia Gillard making a last-ditch attempt to woo the family vote. Ms Gillard declared family fathers will get a 2-week paid parental leave under a Labor government. From July 2012, eligible fathers will receive the minimum wage, currently $570 a week. She said that about 220,000 fathers and other partners would receive benefit from the change, with those earning over $150,000 a year not eligible for the payment. And in the latest election news, the major parties are neck and neck, with this morning's news poll showing the vote is now split 50-50 on a two-party preferred basis. With the election advertising now blacked out and polls sitting on a knife edge, each leader will be hoping to win over undecided voters. Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott have moved into campaign overdrive today, both leaders starting their mornings full of interviews. Today, the Prime Minister will continue campaigning in New South Wales, while the opposition leader continues his 36-hour non-stop marathon in Sydney.
This is a stop number 2 in the 36-hour continuous campaign, and there'll be absolutely no doubt that I am working harder than anyone ever has to be the Prime Minister of Australia.
Now it's over to the panel and Will Goodings.
Thanks, Tineka. My absolute pleasure to introduce our panel for today's election special. First and foremost, Melissa Mack, InDaily AM editor. Welcome to the program, Melissa. Clem McIntyre too, Adelaide University Head School of History and Politics. And John Spoehr, also from the Adelaide University. I tell you what, as a Flinders University alum, I'm a little bit outnumbered here, so I tell you what, I have to represent. John, of course, is the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Social Research and the Centre for Labour Research. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you. Before I do get to you, Melissa, I want to ask you a question, because editor of InDaily, and we know of the Independent Weekly, you're based here in Adelaide. I imagine it has been one tremendously frustrating and difficult task to get an Adelaide focus, or indeed some sort of Adelaide perspective on an election that is, for all intents and purposes, seems to have left the South Australia by.
Yeah, we've spoken to South Australian people during the election and tried to see what issues matter to them.
Has it been difficult, though? I mean, or have you sensed that frustration amongst people here, that they themselves are saying, well, hey, there hasn't been a great deal for us to get our teeth into?
That's true, especially issues like the Murray, which are so important to South Australia. But there have been some that we've covered in the Independent Weekly and InDaily. Yeah,
look, I don't envy you. I think it's been an awfully difficult job. Before we do get into the guts of what this election will be fought over, guys, can I ask first of you, Clem, a question? What were we looking back, this campaign, how will it be remembered, do you think?
Well, I think it's one of the less exciting campaigns in recent years, it's fair to say. I think that for me it's been fairly dispiriting. It's been rather empty of concrete policies and it's not an expression I like, but visionary statements. I think that we've really had a very negative campaign. The concentration has been on attacking each other rather than where we're going, and I think that it's a reflection really of the relative political inexperience of the leaders as leaders of their parties.
So it's more about the personalities involved than what we've learned about how best to form government in this country?
It's a bit of that, and it's a bit of a reflection on the relatively impoverished state of public policy debates in Australia right now, I'd suggest.
Well, John, then I ask you the question. Maybe it makes it all the more difficult in light of that revelation. What do you think, when people are filling out the ballot paper tomorrow, what will be the issues that ultimately define their decision?
Look, I think at the end of the day, even though it's not an inspiring election full of vision, people will take their vote seriously and they'll think about the issues and they'll focus on what it means for them individually, particularly in the marginals where it's going to matter at the moment. This election is going to be won in the marginals. So they'll be looking at some of the individual initiatives. I imagine that Tony Abbott's $2,000 HECS rebate, the higher education contribution rebate, is something that young people are going to look at. And I think the Coalition had a bit of ground to make up in that respect. Clem will probably talk a bit about that later on. But that suggests to me that the Coalition are a bit worried about the youth vote. So they've been courting the youth vote pretty aggressively. The other big issues, of course, parental leave. Both parties have policies on parental leave, and that's, I think, a terrific initiative, well overdue. So we shouldn't overlook issues like that. But in terms of the big picture vision, no, it's not the most exciting election we've seen.
It's picking apart. Is there any particular aspect of any of the policies, perhaps that John mentioned there, Clem, that interest you and are peculiar in a sense of looking back in Australia?
Yes, I mean, obviously, John mentioned the education policy. That's, of course, of interest to us in the universities.
Absolutely.
But I've been struck by the fact that the government's campaign has been built not so much around a range of new policies. Perhaps that's understandable. We're in a relatively not impoverished, but a less confident economic period than we were in the 2007 election, when we can recall the then leader of the opposition accusing the Prime Minister of spending like a drunken sailor in an attempt to win votes. So we never really expected to see huge spending on policies this time around. I think that's fair to say. But I think the government, in some senses, has got a better story to tell than it's actually put out. I think that the fact that unemployment has stayed relatively low, we hear a bit about the extent of the deficit and so on, but by world standards, that's a fractional figure. It's very low by international standards, and I think that I expected to hear a bit more about the relatively stable and prosperous state of the economy over the last few years, a bit more about things like health reform, which I think are touchstone policies for the traditional Labor supporters, and I think that one of the things we should have learned earlier this year is that people are looking for real policies on climate change, and neither party are really giving us much there.
Mel, I noticed that picking up on something that Clem just touched on there, well, rather something that wasn't touched on, and that is some of the factors that indeed the major parties did focus on throughout this campaign. One of them we saw at the outset was population sustainability, and I know you guys at InDaily had a little bit of a look at that. Did you get a sense, Metropolitan and Adelaide, South Australia, is it a concern? Because it was certainly shaped as such when this campaign started.
I think so. I think there's definitely some concern about the urban sprawl that's happening in Adelaide. Developments like up at Mount Barker and Buckland Park, whether there's public transport, the infrastructure to support that kind of thing. I think that's an issue that's a state and federal problem in South Australia.
Well, you had that issue too with the zoning of that land up that way and whether it was best used for residential, agriculture or whatever, which obviously is perhaps more a state issue too, but certainly some of these issues will entirely overlap. Digress though for a second on the sustainability of population, John. It sort of petered out, did it not, over the course of the campaign? Is that a sign that it just didn't find traction with people, or simply the policies weren't inspiring?
Oh, look, I think it was a big issue to start with. There was a lot of fear mongering around it, and this massive population that we were on the verge of having was something that both parties were concerned about, I think, in terms of how that would play out in the electorate. But it's also had some rather nasty elements to it in relation to how that plays out in the asylum seeker debate.
Well, that in fact was where I think we might well have turned our attention next in any case, because certainly if it wasn't population sustainability that took over everyone's focus, it was absolutely an issue about boat people, asylum seekers and immigration policy. all three of those factors, in fact, got probably a little bit muddled over the course of the campaign, Clem.
I think they certainly did. And just to give a concrete example of that, we heard a lot of debates about the number of people arriving by boats.
Yep.
And that was wrapped up into a debate over infrastructure capacity in Western Sydney and southern Queensland and things like that. Now, the numbers of people actually getting off boats are an absolute minuscule number compared to the broader questions of infrastructure, requirements for the growing population and so on. So you're right, those things rolled into a sort of a big ball, and it got very blurred, I think, in terms of making some sense of that.
Do you think that the politicians have used asylum seekers more as a scaremongering tactic rather than perhaps educating the public about what the actual issues are?
I think that if I look at the government's response initially, I think that for me what I was struck by is that they managed to alienate both sides of the political spectrum with their refugee policy, and that takes some doing. I think they were conscious about taking a hard line in relation to refugees. Kevin Rudd on his last night as Prime Minister almost anticipated the sort of drift in policies that would take place under Julia Gillard. And we've seen, I think, a deliberate attempt to try and play to the concerns that some people have of refugees. And that's perhaps driven a few voters from Labor towards the Greens. But at the same time, in relation to some of the policies in terms of the detention of Afghans and Sri Lankans, I think that's worried some people who are more likely to go to the Liberals. So I think, for me, Labor's played this policy fairly poorly in terms of an election, a vote-winning campaign.
Interesting then, and we of course absolutely racing through some of these issues. We've only got a very limited amount of time today, but we mentioned then the last days of the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, and I remember rather vividly in that speech he did make on national television that he feared, or certainly words to the effect that he feared the party lurching to the right. Have we seen evidence of that, do we think, over the course of this campaign? The Labor Party is, if not abandoned traditional roots, certainly migrated a little bit further right?
Well, the distance between the two parties is a lot closer than it used to be, I think it's fair to say. And the race to the middle ground, I think, is very concerning, and it makes it difficult for voters, I think, tomorrow. And of course, the Greens stand out as having a distinctive set of policies in respect of the coalition and Labor. So I think we're going to see a clear drift to the Greens for that reason.
Absolutely. Kevin Rudd too, the Kevin Rudd factor. Maybe it's become a factor in the absence of more concrete policy for people to really get their teeth into. I wonder whether it matters as much to people here in South Australia. Guys, perhaps Mel, you can comment. What do you think? We've certainly heard about it as a factor in Queensland, but here in SA, do people still aggrieved about how that went down?
I'm not sure, actually.
Yeah, well, perhaps it was probably a pretty difficult question, Mel. In fact, it's one that will only be ultimately, I guess, decided tomorrow. Gentlemen, comment?
Look, I don't think it plays out so much here in South Australia, but of course it does in Queensland, and also, in other states. It is in the back of people's minds. I mean, the tough, rough and tumble of political challenges is something that Australians don't warm to. They find it uncomfortable when they see, a major challenge and how it's played out. That's always been the way, but perhaps this one was just a little bit nastier than others.
Absolutely, Clem.
Yeah, look, I'd agree with that. I think, if anything, it's probably played out in reverse in South Australia. I think the bit of the local girl, Julia Gillard, it may make a difference in a seat like Boothby. That might add, perhaps a few hundred votes to Boothby, which might be enough to get Labor over the line there. It may well be shoring up a couple of seats in Victoria, but against that, I think it's going to cost them seats in Queensland, as John's suggesting.
Well, an issue that traditionally does have a lot of traction in South Australia, certainly in recent history, is water. Water infrastructure, water security. Big election issue some 3 years ago.
Yes.
Not so at the moment. Is that a byproduct, do we think, of lack of marginals, or am I being too cynical there?
One process that's going on at the moment is, of course, the Murray-Darling Basin Commission has been in the process of preparing a major plan for Australia for the Murray-Darling Basin. And of course they were going to release it, and the election was called, and they held back off on the release of it. They've been criticised for that. But I can understand why they didn't release it, because it would have been a minefield politically.
Would have been politicised, wouldn't it?
It would have been politicised, and the whole plan may have been undermined as a consequence. Labor allocated, I think, about $3 billion to it, sight unseen. So that's probably a good thing, and I think that attracted a lot of confidence from farmers and others in the community who were looking for a bit of certainty. So that's not a bad start, but it hasn't been a big issue in this campaign, no.
I've got one thought there. This is the second winter election we've had since the Second World War.
Okay.
On our way to vote tomorrow, walking along the street to the local primary school and so we're going to go past green gardens rather than front gardens that are burnt to a crisp, as was the case in November, as early as November, the last election. I just think it's less telling, less in people's face, as it were, in the middle of August than it would have been if we'd gone for an election much later in the year. So that, for me, is one of the reasons it's a bit less important. And South Australia, we've got to remember, is 11 seats in 150. It matters to us here in Adelaide, but it's much less important in the critical states of New South Wales and Queensland.
A little bit like when world leaders turned up to Copenhagen and it was just they had the worst blizzard of all time. That was that's